mean, where would you like me to sit?
Just sit in the middle. You sit in the middle, Africa. All right. So one of the things that caught my attention in what you were saying, we had the comedian Jimmy Carr on our show recently, and he said something that he said that we can't forgive what we can't punish. And you talked about the difference between punishment and accountability.
Yeah.
How are you differentiating that? How do we have accountability without whatever we mean by cancellation?
Oh. By the way, I pause quite a lot so I can think about what I'm saying. To me, accountability can only be taken by the person. You can't force someone to take accountability. To me, accountability requires true introspection. And I don't know that a person can do that when they're driven by shame. I think it could be possible, but in the context in which we speak about it in our culture, to me, it's punishment because it's so reactive. It's so immediate. There's no grace. There's no patience. There is no groundedness. There is nothing intentional about it. It's just a reflex. And I have a feeling that people will have their different sort of ways of defining accountability and both punishment. But I think there's a very big difference because of the reactive nature of it. That's what I think.
And how do you think we ought to do that better?
Which part?
The accountability part. Because right now it feels like, as you say, we jump straight into shaming people, attacking them, taking away their livelihood, whatever that is. But people do wrong things. And as a society, we have an interest in, maintaining a certain window of behavior.
Yeah.
So how do we do that, do you think?
I think grace is a very big one. And I know that can seem like a sort of surface level answer.
3 people agree with you.
I think it can sound like one of those things like, yeah, no shit, grace. But I really think it is that. I think we need to have a level of patience. And the thing that I said at the end, I believe is very important around when you face your own shadow and your own contradictions, only then can you accept and understand other people's. So I think the grace aspect is not a nice to have. I think it's a non-negotiable. And to me, accountability is up to the individual. You can't make someone take accountability. You can force someone into pretending that they are taking accountability, which is what I think we're more comfortable with. We're sort of more comfortable with the pretense of it instead of whether it's actually true. But I'm curious to know, what do you think?
Well, I'm trying to work it out for myself, so I don't know. Let's not waste the audience time with my opinions. Francis, do you have some questions?
I guess my question for you is this. We're talking about accountability and you're asking people to be more introspective. But the reality is we live in a world where introspection is kind of frowned upon because we're more online than ever. We're encouraged to fire off our opinions on a wide range of topics without actually giving them the proper thought and consideration. So I guess my question is, how do we have introspection in a world which is dominated by social media, smartphones, etc.?
See, something that I always stress in my work and to people generally is that all of these things we're talking about, accountability, personal responsibility, self-reflection, self-scrutiny, they're all very unnatural things because as human beings, we externalize, we see what everyone else is doing wrong. But I used that language of it's not a nice to have very intentionally because all of this isn't about opt in because it's going to make you feel good. It depends. If you are someone that sees that there is a problem, whether it's individually or culturally, then I think we have to make a very serious effort to actually self-reflect. How am I behaving? How am I contributing to this culture? Is the way that I'm currently communicating and experiencing people working for me or against me? So I wouldn't even say that I have a neat answer to that, but I don't think self-reflection is a nice to have. I don't think courage or brave expression are just little nice things we can think about, maybe consider, we only have to look around at what's happening culturally to be like, actually, it's really fucking important that all of us reflect on how we are contributing to all of it. Because I think it's easy to point the finger and to blame the woke or to blame the right or to blame whoever. But I think there's a missed opportunity where you don't ask yourself, how am I on a micro level in my micro interactions contributing to what I'm experiencing? That's what I think.
8 people agree with you. But no, I think it's a very profound point, because I think it's so easy to stare into the abyss that is your smartphone and point out, oh, this person's an idiot, this person's triggered, this person.
Yeah.
And you, without actually stopping to think, what are you contributing?
Yes.
Even when we talk about culture, culture is everybody's interactions with something as simple as crossing the road or talking to strangers. Do you give people the time of day?
And to ground all of this in reality, because I think this context is really important. For me, I was led to exploring this work more specifically in the summer of 2020. So since 2016, I've been researching, studying, and really wanting to understand the nature of self-sabotage. Why do human beings get in their own way? Why do we say one thing and do a completely different thing that is in direct contradiction of our values? So I considered myself to be a smart person. I considered myself to be an open-minded person. I was saying that I wanted to have open conversations. But the summer of 2020, with the racial reckoning and everything that was happening with BLM in North America, which spilled into the UK and beyond, I was confronted with my own intolerance. I was forcing people. I was one of those people. And again, we have so many stories about who we are and how we would act. But I really got to see my own shadow. I was one of those people demanding that people post that black fucking square on Tuesday. I was one of those people. I was so insufferable in my own self-righteousness. And it lasted for a very short time. I think for me, it was about a couple of weeks, but it was very intense because I was shown where I was out of integrity. And I saw just how fast you get rewarded for being a victim. I saw how quickly you get praised for self-righteousness. You don't get praised for self-reflection, let alone for quiet self-reflection. You don't get praised for embracing nuance and saying, actually, there's a contradiction here. Is that true? You don't get praised for asking the tough questions. And I got a taste of just how arousing it can be to be in such conviction and self-righteousness. And for me, luckily, that allowed for me to snap out of it and to think, okay, something has to change. And because I'd been studying self-sabotage for a long time, I realized that what was happening was called cancel culture. But I decided to word it as collective sabotage because I think it's a more accurate way to describe what we're seeing culturally. But I bring that up to say, I'm not speaking about these things because I'm holier than thou and I'm some kind of expert getting on stage. That's a part of it. But I had to do some rigorous self-reflection because I saw myself contributing to a problem that I thought I was detached from. You know, I thought that I was on the right side of history. But actually, I was leading with such intolerance that I could have never truly been on any right side of any historical context. So I think that's also important for me to share that part of things in the conversation of self-reflection.
I can't remember who it was that during the summer of 2020 said this, but someone said, I don't know what's going on. My Instagram's broken because it's just black squares everywhere. I'm curious. Victimhood is something we talk about and you see it now. And obviously in that particular situation, it was people from one side of the political spectrum. You see that reflected on the other side increasingly. Why do you think victimhood is so appealing to us? And B, what can we do individually and collectively to not let ourselves get caught up in that righteousness that you talk about?
I'll start with the first part. Why do I think victimhood is so appealing to us? something that I would add here, just from my own personal story, and maybe for some people also here in the audience, I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm from Africa, the south of Africa, and I was born and raised there. And victimhood is not, I'm from a background and a culture where there's true, genuine adversity. There is no denying it. It's not a badge of honor. It's just the reality.
There's a lot of microaggressions.
Yes, there's those. And but something that I'm so grateful for my parents and for just the way in which I was raised, I was never raised to see myself as a victim. Even when we came to the UK in 2001 and there was very obvious racism, there were no conversations about diversity or inclusion. There was nothing like that. So there was quite upfront, overt racism that we faced. And yet we were never made to feel like victims. Even when we were on the poverty line, my mother never, ever said that this is because of our race, this is because we're immigrants, X, Y, Z. So fast forwarding to a culture where I'm made to believe that because of the color of my skin, first of all, that I should lead with the color of my skin, and then I should lead with the fact that I'm a woman, then I should lead with the fact that I'm an immigrant. All of those things which are identity markers, but also part of the game of victimhood, I never connected or resonated with it. But where the self-censorship comes in is I thought I needed to perform the role of a victim in order to be part of my community. I thought that I needed to have some sort of grievance or story about how heavy it was to be a Black person in order to connect with other Black people in the West. But it was never what I truly believed. And when I would speak to other Black immigrants, they would say exactly the same thing, that they didn't resonate with this. To be honest, is a very North American way of sort of viewing the world and viewing race. So for me, I find the conversation around victimhood a very interesting one, because I can understand that there's almost like a social reward to it. But I know that from personal experience, I've never seen the rewards of it, because it's just never been part of my history or the way that I've viewed myself, even though objectively there's kind of all of those markers of a perfect victim, if you will. Yeah.
You mentioned a word that I always find very troubling to me whenever people talk about the Black community or in the Asian community. I'm like going like, in the UK, what we describe as the Asian communities, like Indians and Pakistanis who are about to have a nuclear war, that's a community.
Right.
You know, the Black community is Afro-Caribbeans and people like you from Africa who, as Francis will tell you, because he used to be a teacher, right, the gangs of kids from those two backgrounds who both have the same skin color are having fights in school all the time because they don't see themselves as part of the same community. So how have we got to a point where people unite themselves, or are encouraged at least to unite themselves around these very superficial things, instead of the things that you're talking about, which is your communities, people who think about the same things as you and are interested in the same way of exploring ideas, or whatever it is. Your community might be the people you play football with, or whatever. How do we get to this idea that I can tell which community you belong to by looking at you? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, you know what? At the same time, I get it. I don't think it's useful, because when you unpick all of it, it actually doesn't make any sense, right? Because Black community, which community are we talking about? Because Somalis and Zimbabweans and Nigerians, Ghanaians, very, very different. Even within those same so-called communities, Ghana, for example, very different tribes, different languages, different ways of being, different customs. So when you pick it apart, it falls apart because it doesn't really hold up. And at the same time, I understand it, because these are minority groups in countries and spaces where they are very much on the margins in a lot of ways. So they come together. But I have no idea where the sort of collapse happened. But I also think about it in this way. I can't think of any other race, to be honest, apart from the Black people that have been racialized as Black, who are expected to think, speak, behave in exactly the same way. You know, this idea that blackness looks like a very specific thing, that maybe someone who speaks like me is not black enough. You know, someone who might be into 3 black people in the...
No, it's loads of white people applauding. I don't know why.
You know, this
You're
idea...
not really black.
You know, so I think there, with what we're talking about now, I really am able to hold multiple truths around it. I think there's a level of solidarity that comes from being part of the black community, the Asian community. Although, interestingly, the white community, you can't say that, you know, to be proud of being part of the white community.
Yeah, you can. Oh, I just said it.
It's really fascinating, though, isn't it? And again, I get it. But I think the idea with all of this is that just start to question these things. I wrote down here my declaration about no more repeating mantras and scripts that don't make sense. So when we say things like the black community, what do we actually mean? That's what I do now. I'll just ask someone, not in a sort of antagonistic way, but I'll just say, what do you mean by that when you say black community? And then a lot of the time they don't fucking know. They just, you know, said this thing that they've had. So I'll just sort of repeat the same thing. I can hold multiple truths around the importance of having that language of a racialized community who are on the margins of society in whatever part of the world they are. And I don't find it to be a useful thing to cling on.
Well, right, because the question for me is also, what are you speaking into existence when you say that? And Francis' joke points to this, which is once you say that there's a black community, well, there must be a white community. And then everybody has to think of themselves through their skin color. And now I'm this and you're that. And we forget that we are a community of human beings. And judging each other by these very superficial things is going to be very destructive if we let it happen. Sorry, Francis.
No, one thing that I was going to ask as well is that it's very interesting because in some ways race is a social construct. Like I'll use the example. My mother came from Venezuela where she was white and she came to South London in the 1970s, found out she ain't that white. So, you know, the things that we're brought up to made to believe about race, they're actually malleable depending on the country or society we find ourselves in.
Yes, I agree. Because something that I often think about and say is that I never realized I was black until I came to the UK when I was 9 years old, because I never had to think about it. And then suddenly there was a hyper awareness of my race, because where we moved to in the UK, it was a predominantly white county. And then after that, a few years on, moving to London, where suddenly I'm being told that I'm not black enough because I didn't speak like a black Londoner. So I think all of my life, in so many different ways, I've been able to truly understand that all of it means something, but it means absolutely nothing because it can change depending on the context, you know. I do think that's why I'm so serious about this message of brave expression and pushing back against the culture of intolerance that we've created, because I think it's squashing us all into sort of these identity checklists where we don't actually have the patience to truly understand a human being. And I can't remember if you and I was saying this to you last time we spoke a couple of years ago, but I was saying that I think it's quite sad that someone might think, oh, I can't tell Africa that joke because she's black, she won't understand. Like, I want to know the fucking joke. Like, I want to know the joke.
Sounds like an accusation, doesn't it?
Are you ready? Francis is going to tell the joke.
Well.
But I think what I'm trying to say there is that I really had to realize that seeing everything through the lens of identity, whether it's race or gender, sex, whatever the thing might be, it's very anti-intimacy in a lot of ways, because it doesn't allow for us to surprise each other. It doesn't allow for that conversational and emotional risks. When you make a risk in conversation and you kind of see what happens, you know. And I think all of it is not just anti-intellectual, which I think is where we tend to stay, but I think it's just anti-intimacy. How can we deepen a relationship with the self or other if we just filter everything through all of these markers. And it's quite sinister when you really think about it, you know.
I think this is why Francis always has ethnic minority girlfriends, so you can do the racial banter in the relationship.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically one long attempt to not look racist.
A failed attempt.
Yeah, a failed attempt, because I open my mouth and they go, there he is. Africa, one of the things I love about you is you work a lot with people to help people to be better, to improve themselves. And both Konstantin and I are big believers in personal development, constant improvement, constant development, in order for you to achieve what you want to achieve, but also, more importantly, to become more at one with who you are and to become happier.
Yeah.
What would you say are some basic tools that people who are listening to this and watching this, they can take away and they can implement in their own lives?
Where I like to focus, because I think a lot of these things can feel so big, especially when we're talking about identity politics and censorship. It can just feel so massive. It feels motivating and inspiring to look into it when you have the capacity and energy. But then when you leave and you go about your day, it's all just so big. So I like to bring it back to the self. And the place that I personally like to focus is, what is your current relationship with self-censorship? Because to me, that is one of the things that is underpinning a lot of the problems that we have. We've come to a point where we just casually agree with things that we don't actually agree with. And we don't really see it as a problem, because it just seems like, oh, but it's just this one time. But I promised you, you do it once, you will do it again and again and again and again. It will just look different up until the point where you don't even realize you're doing it anymore. So I just invite you to start thinking, and it's a very internal thing, but just start being very honest about what your relationship with self-censorship is. What happens when a question is turned onto you? And we think that it's about self-silencing full stop, but it's actually when you say things that you know very well are not true, where you don't allow for yourself to see that there are different ways to respond. You're allowed to say, I don't know. You're allowed to say that I've changed my mind. You're allowed to say, I don't know what I think about this, actually. You're allowed to say, I don't want to talk about this. You know, I think, and these are seemingly simple things that we dismiss because we kind of want the big thing that you can go away and do, but it's those tiny little moments, those micro interactions. I just want to invite you, when you leave here or the next conversation you have, just start to pay attention to where you're muting your voice just a little bit or overcompensating in some way, because that's also self-censorship. You overcompensate and actually silence the very thing that is true. So I think my sort of task is to just take on the role of the observer for the next 24 hours in all your conversations. That's what I would say. Yeah. That's what I would say.
I guess one of the things that drives people to censor themselves is various kinds of social, economic, and other concerns. How do you see? I often get this criticism, and I feel guilty because I often don't have the answer. People go, well, you talk about, I mean, I have an answer to it, but it's not a satisfying one to some people. Like, they go, well, you know, not everyone's going to have a podcast. Not everyone's going to write a book. Like, if I get fired from my job stacking shelves in the supermarket, I'm not going to launch a media career off the back of it. So the concern about the impact of being more truthful is real for a lot of people who've got families, etc. So what do you say to those people?
To me, so it sounds like one of those things where it's like, well, good for you, Africa, but I'll lose my job or my kids or my whatever, right? I always find it so interesting how we immediately go to the extremes. And this is kind of the binary thinking, right? This idea that the truth is going to lead to punishment. If I speak the truth, I will lose everything. So what I usually do is kind of just gently point out the sort of binary thinking, this idea that you don't have options. Do you not have a single friend that you can start to explore that conversation with? Can you not, are you making the effort to find an online or offline community that is not online? Because again, I think we've started to think everything is a digital first approach, that to undo self-censorship means that you need to make a 5-slide infographic and declare your new position. That is not what it means. I really think this idea of unraveling self-censorship means that I have to publicly share my stance and stand up and say to my boss that this is what I think, these are my political opinions. No, it's a much more gentle process. I'll come back to this, but it's in the micro interactions, in the repeated micro interactions, where you start to exercise a braver, more courageous voice. If you have a political opinion that is more inflammatory, look for people in your life who you can speak to. Start practicing there. Find online communities. I think with the globalization of technology and where we are, it's such a beautiful thing that you can find so many communities right here. So I would invite people to not go to those extremes of if I speak, I will lose everything, because I think that can be a cop-out also a lot of the time.
And it's also as well that courage is a muscle. You need to exercise it, you need to constantly use it, and then it will develop. But it also speaks to the way we see society now, in that, oh, I've got to be like this tomorrow. No, it takes time. It takes time for whatever you want to do in life, whether whether you want to teach, whether you want to be an academic, an engineer, or whatever it may be. It takes time, and courage is one of those things as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also easy to look at me now, or to look at both of you, etc. But there was a time where I was so afraid. I was so afraid to even listen to thinkers who I had been told were problematic. So none of this was sort of overnight. It was a very gentle process, and a very solitary process, actually, in the beginning, of thinking about the people, even people like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Coleman Hughes, who's now a friend, even both of you and so many other people.
Mate, I'm just delighted to be called a thinker. Do you know what I mean? That's a win.
It's because it's the first time it's happened.
People that I had been told were absolute evil. And I experienced so much cognitive dissonance because I really did have a conditioning and a story of this is what you're allowed to agree with and this is not what you're allowed to agree with. So for me, it was a very solitary process to think, who have I discarded without question? So I was listening to things that I would have just immediately rejected without question, and allowed for myself internally to become comfortable first. I think it's a sort of full sort of nervous system rework when it comes to bravery and courage. It's not just about what you're saying, but it's about rewiring yourself. So I think if you make room for all of this to be much more slower, to be really beautiful, and to be so intricate, and to be boring, and to just be little moments where you listen to something and it makes you feel uncomfortable, offended, triggered, whatever it is, you sit with it for a little bit, have a conversation with someone, say that you don't have an opinion in a social context where you would have agreed with everyone else. It's so slow and subtle, So I really don't want us to think that courage and bravery and undoing self-censorship is about going online and declaring your opinions, going into the office, telling everyone what you think. For some people, it might be, and I will say that, for some people, they are able to just go the full mile because they need to, but not everyone needs to do that. So I think it's also honoring who you are as a person, meeting yourself where you are, then going just a little bit further, but also just using common sense. You can do that too,
Hopefully. What I really like about you is that you are someone who does what you've just talked about very well, which is you disagree and challenge in a very diplomatic way, to the point I'm like, I'm not sure, I don't know if Africa does disagree with me, but her voice sounds really nice. That is something I don't do very well generally. How does somebody find a way to, while they're exploring that, to, as you say, not like rush out on the internet and start spouting off your newly found opinions that you downloaded from someone else 5 minutes ago?
Yeah. Ooh, this is a good one. And it's something, I know we're running out of time, but it's something that I write about. I really want you to think about your current communication style. And I know that sounds like but please really think about your communication style, because that can give you a good sense of what's working and not working right now. So some people are very passive in the way that they communicate. So you are more likely to fawn in conversations. You're more likely to agree with things that you don't agree with at all. Some people, and it's much more specific. So maybe you can find me and I can give you more context to this. Some people are very passive aggressive, so you never really know what they actually think in conversation.
People.
British people, yeah. They're more passive aggressive in conversations, but they tend to have a very complicated relationship with self-censorship because they keep everything in, but then they keep it in so much that it eventually comes out in unhelpful ways.
Laughter recognition.
Yeah.
And then some people who come to me, and it's usually men, who will say things like, well, my problem is not self-censorship. Their problem is a little bit different. They have an unrefined social filter. So they are the people that are saying everyone needs to have a backbone, just say whatever you want to. Everyone's gone woke, blah, blah, blah. They usually, we love you, but they're usually those people. But where they end up meeting with the people that do self-censor is that they are both ineffective in their communication because they lack empathy, they lack patience, they lack understanding. So understanding your communication style is actually very important because it can give you a bit of an idea of why the world is responding to you in the way that it is. That's what I'd say.
Africa Brooke, ladies and gentlemen.
There we go.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well done.